Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Alex Stokes with the Ethereum Foundation. I will be talking about how we're going to merge Eth1 into Eth2. And yeah, hopefully what that even means will make sense after this talk. So we're just going to dive in. There's not a lot of time, and hopefully there's room for questions. So you guys have heard of Eth2 at this point, I hope. Essentially, there's this whole new network we're building. It should give us increased security with proof of stake and increased throughput in terms of transactions with this like sharded architecture. So a key outcome, right, of this whole thing is that it's not that we're making a new network, we're making a sort of upgraded network, and so we want it to look and feel like there's this sort of seamless migration from the Ethereum today to this new network. Also, sorry the clicker doesn't work, so I have to walk back and forth. Right, so this is kind of what I just said. Eth1 is this awesome thing we have today. There's already all this stuff happening on it with DeFi, right? There's all this economic activity. We can't just sort of toss that out with this new Eth2. We have to like bring that, into this new network. And how are we going to do that? Because of the design you'll see in just a second, it's not immediately clear. So this is the question: how to merge Eth1 and Eth2. Here's a quick little agenda. I'll give you some context on Eth2 so the other stuff makes sense. There's kind of two different approaches right now. This is very much sort of an open-ended research question as the best way to do this. You can kind of summarize the two approaches. The first one is building a bridge between the two networks, and the other one is essentially making Eth1 a special shard of the new network. And we'll look at sort of what those mean, sort of mechanically, and then also we'll talk about some of the pros and cons and see what makes sense. So it doesn't go backwards.
It doesn't go backwards.
It doesn't go backwards. So it'll go forward, but it doesn't go backwards. Yeah. So.
It's just like life. Think like money.
It's okay. This is fine. Right. So the first, really an important thing to know here is that Eth2, there's essentially phases of it. So it's being deployed in kind of these stages. Part of this is to just get it right. This whole thing is very complex, so it's easier to get each piece right if they're smaller pieces rather than deploy this whole new thing all at once, right? Yeah, phase design, we'll look at the phases in just a second. Importantly, it'd be really nice if we could get something out of each phase from Eth2 for Eth1, and that kind of actually informed a lot of this bridge approach, and I'll kind of point that out as we go. Okay, so these phases I keep talking about, important ones, phase 0, 1, and phase 2. So with phase 0, we have the lovely beacon chain. This is supposed to be a blockchain. Blocks point to their parents, and it keeps going. The way to think about it is that this is sort of like a system-level chain. So it's going to basically keep track of who the validators of the system are and what the shards are doing and all the state of the shards and all this stuff, right? There aren't any user-level transactions happening on this chain. Then we get to phase 1, the phase after phase 0, and we introduce all the shard chains. And so what I tried to do here is these are beacon blocks in this chain. The way to think about this is that basically each shard is kind of its own blockchain working in parallel, okay? So then these circles are the shard blocks, and they're kind of connected this way, but then I did this smeary thing to show that there's many of them. So right now there's, say, 64, right? So rather than having one ETH chain, there's now 64 all working in parallel, and that's where you get this increased throughput. Also, it's important to note in phase 1 that basically these are just, you can think of them as just random bytes in the blocks. There aren't transactions or smart contracts or any of this stuff yet. It's just literally you'll pay someone to put junk in there. But it might be junk you care about. Then we have phase 2. Phase 2 has this notion of state execution. So rather than now just having, blobs of binary data in the shard blocks, you now interpret those in certain ways. And for example, now it's transactions to Augur or MakerDAO or 0x, these different things. And so then finally by phase 2, we have what we know and love as Eth1 today, but in this much greater system. Also, it's important to note that to do this in a way that feels nice to everyone has a lot of very like open-ended questions still. And so it's not immediately clear that we can just kind of go straight here, deploying phase 0, phase 1, phase 2. There's still a lot to like figure out here, and that's going to inform kind of the conversation as we get to these different ways to merge in the two systems. So like I said, there's these two approaches. First one, build a bridge. The idea is that you have the Eth1 network and the Eth2 network, and they're completely separate networks. They don't know about each other at all. But what we can do is basically have light clients embedded into each network of the other one, and so then they can learn about each other that way, okay? And yeah, so this arrow is like Eth2 is a light client of Eth1, and Eth1 is a light client of Eth2. The other approach is you make Eth1 a special shard, okay? And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means when we get to that part, but essentially you can imagine Eth1 is just kind of lifted and hoisted into the new system when it's ready, and it should be, quote, seamless with the rest of the system. And like ultimately we want something to look and feel like that it's like, quote, seamless. The question is like, how do we get there? And that's kind of what this slide is about, is like, where's all this going? So you basically want to like take the Eth1 state and move it into Eth2. The exact details are still TBD. And the question is like, how quickly can we do this, basically? There's a lot of benefits we'll get from the Eth2 system for Eth1, and if we can like find ways to like migrate sooner rather than later, then we definitely would prefer that. And that's part of the reason why we have the second approach that we'll look at after this building a bridge part, is we think that we can probably get there faster. So building a bridge. Again, two separate networks. We're gonna have light clients between them. So the way to think about this, well, already today in the phase 0 spec with the beacon chain, this is set in stone. It effectively is a light client of the Eth1 chain. There's this deposit contract you might have heard of. That's how validators enter the new system from Eth1 into Eth2. It's not necessarily the best light client, but it is one. And so Eth2 already is aware of Eth1 block hashes, let's say, and like the state of this deposit contract. So then to like build a bridge, right, to go both ways, you would then have to add some Eth2 light client to Eth1 nodes so that then they're aware of the Eth2 state. And then we can start doing lots of fun things. And this is where these like benefits I listed, or I motioned to earlier, would come into play. So with the first phase, phase 0, we would get what you might have heard of this thing called the Finality Gadget. The basic idea is that the beacon chain, actually, okay, well, I have some nice photos. We'll just skip ahead. So the idea, this is the beacon chain, right? The thing I showed you earlier with the square blocks and all the colors. So this is the beacon chain, this is the Eth1 chain. The way that this light client works already on the beacon chain is that so many blocks, it'll kind of ratchet up the Eth1 chain and learn about sort of a new block height, right? Like a new block higher up the chain, if everything goes according to plan. And then there's a separate process that comes out of the sort of Casper proof of stake consensus on the beacon chain, which is called finality. This is basically sort of how we get our economic security for the system. The idea then is that as we're learning about new Eth1 blocks, and as we finalize this chain, then we sort of implicitly finalize all of the Eth1 blocks, that Eth1 block, then also all the ones before it. And that's what this picture is trying to show. So this is like finality, this like nice golden economic security, keeping everything safe. A big reason people are excited about this is that you could imagine then lowering the issuance, right, of the proof of work rewards because you are, again, relying on this finality. So beacon chain security would kind of cover part of your security spend for the proof of work chain, lower the block rewards, right? Then we have the next phase, phase 1. This one is actually pretty cool. The idea is basically to use these shard chains as data. So if I go back a lot, right? I said that these are just like random, it's random binary data, right? So like one thing you can imagine is if there was a connection from Eth1 to Eth2, then you could then basically, utilize this data for applications on ETH1, right? And so if you're familiar with these like sort of L2 constructions, like rollups, so ZK rollup, optimistic rollup, every so often they need to like commit state transitions to the chain, right? Which again is just this binary data. And so that's what you would use the shards for in phase one, is exactly this. That's what this says. And here's an overwhelming photo. So beacon chain, ETH1 chain, Finality Gadget is happening. There's a point at which we then modify the ETH1 network to be aware of this ETH2 beacon state, right? State on this beacon chain. And then because of that, you then can effectively make proofs. You would imagine there's like, some contract here that then is like reading the beacon state, right? Because now there's some fancy opcode that gives you that data. The beacon state then is like, the state root of this thing. You can essentially then make a very extended proof into the shard block, right? And then like say, hey, there is this data at this point in time. Do some stuff with my rollup state locally to the contract here. So layer 2 data, all this stuff, shard chains, lots of blocks. Scalability is the takeaway. So, and then kind of like, I gave you the end first, but basically then at some point we figure out phase 2 and all of the sort of research questions there, and we can, merge ETH1 into ETH2 and not have to do, all this stuff through the bridge. And then it becomes, quote, seamless, which would be nice. So, maybe this sounds exciting. Well, actually, I guess I could, are there any questions yet? Okay, we'll wait to the end then. It seems like this is kind of progressive, and that was the idea behind the design, is like, hey, at each stage we kind of do a little bit more and like get a little bit more out of it. However, there's some issues here that might not be obvious at first, but basically, because we're using like clients to go between the chains and we have this sort of like client bridge, there's a question of latency. So already, I said there is this, Already I said there was this ratcheting process, right? So like every so often, ETH2 would learn about like a new ETH1 block, but it wouldn't be like block by block by block. It would like skip a bunch of blocks. And so already to like have finality extend to the ETH1 chain, to do things like make proofs about data in the shard chains, this would take some crazy amount of time. Right now it's like 4 or 5 hours. Of course, for this to be useful, we would shorten that, but then you have all these attacks that could like come in, either on the proof of work consensus or the proof of stake consensus, that could affect this bridge, and that's where this stuff starts to get pretty dicey. Also, there's like some operational concerns. So like client infrastructure for the beacon chain was kind of deferred until phase 1. What this means is that if we wanted to do this in phase 0 and all this Finality Gadget stuff, as a node operator, you'd have to run essentially a full ETH2 node and a full ETH1 node, which a lot of people may not want to do, because already we have issues with running ETH1 nodes. So that's not great. Okay, so the bottom, like the takeaway from the previous bit is that this bridge could be kind of clunky and like open up 5 minutes, lead to a bunch of these different attacks. So instead you could imagine waiting until ETH1 is ready to do this migration and just kind of do it early. And you would basically be taking some shortcuts around these phase 2 questions just to like do it as quickly as possible. And the big bet here is actually making ETH1 stateless. There's a lot of work on stateless Ethereum, which I might not have a lot of time to go into, but essentially you wouldn't need the ETH1 state to make, at least to validate the chain, because you would attach the state to the transactions. Yeah, the way to think about this is basically just wait until we can just plop the thing in and just move it in. The main benefit here, right, is sort of this native integration of ETH1 and ETH2. The question is, it might take a little bit longer compared to having this bridge, but also you skipped all this like weird attack surface of having this very complicated like client thing both ways. And of course, the biggest risk here is stateless clients. There's a lot of early work on it. It looks quite promising, but that's something to consider. And yeah, it's not super clear what the path forward is. So just remember, right, that like this is all one community. We're here to like build all this stuff together. So if you'd like to get involved, there's stuff happening all over the place. Stuff on ETH Research, the Fellowship of ETH Magicians Forum, GitHubs for like all this stuff. This is me on like all these different services. If you want to like ask me questions about this stuff, I can point you to different places to get involved. And now I'll open it to questions. I think we have a few minutes.
Do you know anybody who's hiring to work on this stuff?
Yeah, so I think, well, do you? Yeah, so let's see. We are looking for some help with Trinity, which is a Python client that is touching all of these questions, stateless Ethereum, Eth2. If you're looking to work on that kind of stuff, definitely come talk to me. Good question. Yep.
Is the plan for validators running on the Eth1 shard to have all of the state for Eth1 while they're validating it?
If they're block producers. So that's...
So they're block producers, they'll have the state and then they disseminate with the witness for the other people.
Exactly, yeah. So I kind of glossed over this because we were a little short on time, but basically, if we did this, then it's not that... So validators essentially eventually they'll touch every shard. And this happens in like a stateless fashion, which means that they don't need the state of some sort of, let's say, execution environment on top of the thing, on top of the shard, right? So instead, you could then imagine splitting these roles out where there's like validators who are actually validating the chain in the stateless way. Then there's block producers themselves that then have the full state. Or maybe they go to like a state provider or something. Again, we're having all these conversations in the stateless Ethereum world right now. Same problem.
Are there any talks that people could go to learn about stateless clients later?
Yeah, so Piper Merriam's having a talk later at 12:30? 12:50, sorry. I don't know which room, but we will basically be continuing the conversation here of like, how are we going to make all this work? Because it's not clear.
So the Eth2 development is kind of hard to follow.
Okay.
And I'm wondering, is there a diversity of opinions about transition strategy amongst the Eth2 teams? Like, do some teams think one thing better than the other, or is there a general kind of consensus, or everybody kind of agrees that it's super hard to figure out?
Probably more of the latter. There are many ETH2 teams, and a lot of them have their hands full with phase 0, which is just like getting this beacon chain shipped. So, you know, these are interesting questions. It's a little bit down the road. It does look like the fastest we could do this would be this making a special shard approach, but that is blocked on having stateless clients for ETH1. So, you know, don't quote me on this. It could take another 2 years, let's say, to get to stateless clients for ETH1. Maybe another 2 years to get to phase 1, so the timelines kind of line up. Yeah, but it's
Guys, if you want to
research.
keep asking questions, guys can take it outside and use the lobby to keep it going. We're going to quickly switch. Please clap. Yeah, put your hands together. Alex, take the love.
Yeah, I would like it back.
So you get more with Rupert? Yeah, that's fine. Cool. I'll make sure I'll find you later. If you want to find me on Telegram, it's elementary complexity.
Well, you'll be in this room, right?
Yeah, my shift goes until 12.
Well, I'll just come back after